We will now continue with the next block. So it's focusing a bit more on the climate science and how do we know the stuff that's happening around climate change. So the question is, who's doing all this research and who's telling us this? So the IPCC is a really important organization. So the IPCC, they stand for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's a big group of scientists from all over the world. And they help us understand climate change by putting all the science in one place. So there's a lot of science being done. And their role is really to bring together the science and publish it for the world. And so what they really do is they read and review thousands of studies. And every few years, they write reports that explain how the climate is changing, the causes of climate change, what might happen in the future, and what can we do. So if you're looking for a trustworthy source about climate change, then it's really good to always look for IPCC, because that's the state-of-the-art information on this topic. And also on this image, for example, you can see how a large group of scientists is working on this together. And the question, of course, is how do we know what will happen in the future? So scientists, they use climate models, and climate models are made in computers to simulate how the Earth's climate works. So how is the air, oceans, land, and ice all interacting together? And what they do is it's like a fake Earth in the computer, but they feed the model with real data from the past. So temperatures, rainfall, CO2 levels from the past, because we have, of course, a lot of measurements from the past, because we know what that has already happened. And then they ask the question, what will happen if we keep on polluting? So if we raise, for example, the CO2 concentrations in the air. So of course, we don't know anything, or we don't know the future. I cannot predict the future, but at least we can look at some different possible futures. And that's where we use scenarios to see what will be the effect, for example, if we would look at low emissions. So there would only be little warming on Earth. Or what would happen if we continue with medium emissions? You could see a little moderate warming. But what would happen if we just keep on emitting CO2, burning fossil fuels? We would have a future that would be with high CO2 concentrations and really hot. So it's important here to realize as well that our future really depends on the choices that we make today. So depending on how much we will be emitting, we will see how much climate change we will face. So to illustrate a bit of the difference and the effects of these different scenarios, you can see this graph made by the IPCC, and you can see how low emission scenarios, they would only result in a temperature increase of like 1.5, not even up to 2 degrees Celsius. However, if we would look to the high emission scenario, so a lot of fossil fuel burning, you can see that it could be even up to 5 degrees Celsius in 2100 compared to before 1900. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and it really depends on choices and policies that are being made. So we'll do a short exercise again with a poll, and I'm curious to know what you think about climate change. Do you think it will become hotter in the future or not? So I see that 96% of you think that it will become hotter in the future, and that only 2 of you think it won't become hotter in the future. So let's take a look at what it would mean for the continent of Africa. So on the next slide, I can show you what the IPCC Atlas shows. So you can also go to the IPCC Atlas and even play around a bit with this yourself if you would like to look at it. But what we see here is on the left side, you would see a future with low emissions, and on the right side, we see a future with high emissions. Both cases, we can see that the annual temperature in 2050 would be higher than in before 1900. However, the main difference is that in the low emission scenario, the difference is just quite small, so around 0 to 2 degrees increase. But especially in the high emission scenario, you can see that the increases can be really high. And especially, for example, in the northern regions of Africa, which are already quite high, really hot temperatures, you can see that the increase is the largest. So that could become really problematic in those regions. And we would also like to look a bit more about at rainfall. So I would like to ask you for another poll with the statement, I think it will become drier in the future. What do you think about this? You could say yes, or you could answer no. So most of us think that it will become drier, 78%, and 22% says no, it won't become drier. So it's a bit, more spread out with this question. And I also see somebody now saying in the chat, I think some places will be drier and some places will have floods. So that's really interesting and also really relevant comment for what we'll see on the next slide. So we now see a similar image as well from the IPCC Atlas. And on the left, again, a future with low emissions. And on the right, you can see a future with high emissions. And what we see on the map is the total rain per year in a year. So this map looks a bit different because you can see that some areas will become drier and some areas will become wetter. So you see the percentage of change in rain. So for example, in the central north of Africa, you can really see it will become wetter, but more towards the south, it will become drier. However, what you also see on those maps is those stripes, those diagonal stripes, and they say, well, in these areas, we're not yet too certain. So there's a low confidence, and that's why they don't want to make big statements on that. So you can see that there's more uncertainty about that than for temperature. And how do they know it's low confidence? So for example, for this map, they use 30 different models, but then not all models say the same. So if there's a lot of different ideas among those models, they say there's low confidence. So that's why they put those areas with those stripes. So that's important to realize. So we were really looking at the total rain and also already saying that there's more uncertainty about rain. And I would also really like to state here that it's not only the amount of rain that's important. In many regions, we can also see that the rains become much more unpredictable and that the year-to-year variations are really big. So one year could be really dry and the other could be really wet. And then still the average seems to be okay, but the variations are not what we want, of course. Also in the regions where we work, we can see that the rain seasons are becoming shorter and that there's more extreme rain. So the total rain may be the same, but if it all falls in 1 hour, it's also no use for us. So those are also really important things to realize when talking about rain.